Russia is rampaging through Ukraine. Every day, Vladimir Putin's forces snatch up more Ukrainian territory, and it's only a matter of time before the Donbass defense finally collapses. And with the Donbass claimed, Russia can focus on the rest of Ukraine. Russia's forces will march into Kyiv itself and claim the entire country unless Ukraine acquiesces to Putin's maximalist demands right now. That's what Putin wants the entire world to believe is happening in Ukraine. The reality is much different. Putin's single-minded focus on claiming Ukraine has devoured Russia from within, and this demolition of his own country has all been done in return for a paltry 1.45% of Ukraine. That's according to The Economist, which published an in-depth report on December 2nd that highlights how little Russia has gained in return for the sheer number of soldiers lost in Ukraine. The outlet notes that Russia's gains have been slightly faster in 2025 than they have in previous years, noting that Russia's forces have managed to occupy 4,562 square kilometers, or about 1,760 square miles of Ukraine, up to December of this year. That isn't a lot, especially when considering the size of Ukraine, but it's better than the 3,704 square kilometers, or around 1,440 square miles that Russia captured in 2024. November also saw Russia's forces advance at a near record-breaking pace, at least since the initial days of Putin's invasion. Around 690 square kilometers, or 266 square miles of Ukraine fell to Russia in just 30 days last month. That faster pace seems like it might signal bad things for Ukraine's future. However, there are caveats to all of this, and they are caveats that Putin would prefer to keep the rest of the world from understanding. First, the numbers that we've just mentioned, though seeming impressive when stated, aren't as massive as they might appear. 266 square miles in November is equivalent to Russia capturing 1.5 Los Angeles international airports, or LAXs, per day. Much of that territory is empty ground that Russia occupies as it attempts to conduct assaults on Ukraine's fortress cities. It's Russia's failure to capture these cities that's the major problem. A recent and faster pace means very little when Russia's failure to break a single large city is taken into account. Even smaller cities such as Pokrovsk, which Russia has been attacking for well over a year, take a long time to fall under Putin's current strategy, and that has amounted to minimal gains for Russia in nearly 4 years of warfare. How minimal? The Economist lays the numbers bare, stating, "Over the past 3 years, Russia has captured only an additional 1.45% of Ukraine's land, home to around the same share of its pre-invasion population. No large city has changed hands. Russia has fought to fully capture Pokrovsk, which, with a population of 61,000, was only Ukraine's 73rd largest city before the war, for 14 months. We'll repeat that headline figure there, 1.45% of Ukraine in 3 years. In more than 3 years of brutal fighting, that percentage of Ukraine occupied is, in a word, pathetic. Overall, Russia occupies about 20% of Ukraine, which includes the Crimean Peninsula that Russia seized in 2014, as well as the regions of southern and eastern Ukraine that Russia managed to grab before Ukraine pushed its forces back during the early stages of Putin's invasion. Ever since the Ukraine war settled into what we've seen for the last few years, Russia's advances have been microscopic, and they have occurred at a snail's pace. They've also been costly. So costly that questions have to be raised about whether all of this is worth it in Russia. According to The Economist, a meta-estimate suggests that Russia has lost between 1 million and 1.35 million soldiers to death or injury since the war began. United 24 Media adds that this scale of casualties is roughly equivalent to the number of US soldiers that the US lost during World War II in a fairly similar timeframe. The National World War II Museum roughly supports this estimate, stating that the US suffered 416,800 soldier deaths during that enormous war, though it doesn't say how many soldiers were wounded. This seems like a more difficult figure to come by, with the museum stating that worldwide casualty figures vary widely depending on the source. Still, the point still stands, the US lost this number of people in the process of retaking much of Western Europe from Nazi Germany, along with aiding in the fall of Germany itself and capturing territory in Africa and Asia. In other words, the US lost as many soldiers taking or helping to take multiple countries during World War II as Russia has lost in taking just 1.45% of Ukraine. During the first half of 2025 alone, 100,000 Russian soldiers have died, according to US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. That's about a quarter of the number of American soldiers who died during World War II, and this death count was experienced during just 6 months. Of course, sustaining massive losses over the course of a war is the Russian way. Some historians in Russia claim that the Soviet Union experienced 16 million World War II casualties. with 11.5 million of those being military personnel. Other estimates are different, with the National World War II Museum claiming that the Soviet Union lost between 8.8 million and 10.7 million soldiers, along with up to 15.2 million civilians. But the point remains the same. Attrition of equipment and people has been a Russian strategy for decades, and it's one that Putin has deployed in Ukraine. Still, up to 1.35 million soldiers lost for 1.45% of Ukraine is a ridiculous set of numbers, even when taking this attritional approach in response. And as The Economist points out, it means that as much as 1% of the male Russian population that is of fighting age has already died in Ukraine. More will come. In an October report, Politico noted that the ratio of Russian dead to wounded has dropped to a level that will force Russia to recruit in even greater numbers. Citing a report prepared by the Ukrainian military intelligence hotline I Want to Live, the outlet says, due to the lack of a normal system of evacuating the wounded from the battlefield, there are only 1.3 wounded soldiers per one dead. This signals a low level of survival of the wounded, who are poorly trained in tactical medicine and are usually abandoned without help after injury. So Russia isn't making its tiny gains by losing soldiers that can be returned to the front lines when they recover. Almost half of all Russia's casualties now are deaths, and that has a severe impact on the country's ability to advance at anywhere near the pace that Putin expected. The maths involved in Russia's military strategy also doesn't work out in Putin's favor. According to Euromaidan Press, as well as The Economist, the current rate of Russia's progress means that it would need until May 2028 if it's to seize the 4 Ukrainian regions that it currently partially occupies. These regions are Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, and they all collectively represent another 20,345 square kilometers of Ukraine that needs to be captured for complete occupation of all 4. May 2028 is about 2.5 years from the date of this video's publication, which also indicates how many soldiers Russia would lose for these territory captures. If up to 1.35 million Russians have died, been injured, or been captured by Ukraine over the course of almost 4 years of war, another roughly 800 to 900,000 will have to experience the same fate if the 4 regions mentioned are to fall entirely. That would push Russia's casualty rate above 2 million soldiers, and it would still only hold about 22 or 23% of Ukraine. Let's examine the numbers in another way. We mentioned earlier that Russia currently holds about 20% of Ukraine, with The Economist stating that it's only captured 1.4% of that territory over the last 3 years. That means there's another 80% of Ukraine to go if Russia is going to take all of Ukraine. If we divide 80% by 1.5%, we get a little over 55 blocks of 3 years that Russia will have to spend fighting in Ukraine to achieve Putin's ambition. Multiply those 55 blocks by 3 years per block, and you get a total of about 165 years. That's how long Russia will have to spend fighting, assuming all conditions remain as they are right now. For context, and this assumes that Ukraine's defenses hold for all 165 years, this means that Russia would end up losing over 55.6 million of its soldiers in a war that wouldn't end for generations after Putin and his cronies have died. Of course, Ukraine is also suffering from attrition, and we'll dig deeper into that problem later in the video. Still, these numbers highlight the absolute grind of a war that Putin has created, and they show us that Russia's advances are nowhere near as impressive as Putin wants the world to believe. Far from dominating Ukraine, Putin is devouring Russia from the inside, which could mean that he leaves behind a shell of a country no matter what the eventual outcome of the Ukraine war ends up being. What does all of this mean for Russia, at least in the immediate future? The numbers that The Economist shares should show those involved in the Ukraine war peace discussions, particularly the United States, that Russia doesn't have the amount of leverage that it claims to have. The Jamestown Foundation pointed out that territory gained in Ukraine has been Putin's main source of leverage in peace negotiations ever since those negotiations began. In a November 26th piece, the outlet said, "Moscow's approach to peace negotiations is rooted in leverage, not goodwill. Moscow escalates threats when talks falter and pivots its positions to project strength, particularly before major diplomatic events." We've seen this pattern play out many times already, and it's leverage that Putin seeks as peace talks have grown more intense in recent weeks. As The Economist says, it's no coincidence that Russia made grand claims about having seized Pokrovsk just days before US President Donald Trump's envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were due to arrive in Moscow for peace talks. Perception is everything in the Ukraine war, at least for Putin, and he wanted to create the impression that Russia was making massive advances that included the taking of what has long been a key logistical city on the Donetsk front. Russia was lying about the fall of Pokrovsk. As Australia's ABC News revealed on December 6th, Ukraine continues to dispute Russia's claims about the city, and its soldiers are still fighting hard to keep Pokrovsk. This isn't to say the city won't eventually fall. It likely will, as Ukraine now seems intent on causing as much bloodshed as possible before its soldiers retreat to the other fortress cities in Donetsk that Putin has yet to take. But the point here is that Pokrovsk hadn't fallen when Putin claimed it had, and the biggest reason he made that claim when he did was to attempt to create the impression that Russia is storming forward ahead of the US visit. This isn't speculation either. Although Russia hasn't admitted to its Pokrovsk lie, and likely never will, it's made it clear how much it believes that claiming territory gives it leverage in peace talks. On December 3rd, after the talks with the US proved inconclusive, Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov highlighted that Russia believes that territory alone should determine the outcome of the negotiations. The progress and nature of the negotiations were influenced by the successes of the Russian army on the battlefield in recent weeks, Ushakov claimed, before adding, "Our Russian soldiers, through their military exploits, have helped make the assessments of our foreign partners regarding the path to a peace settlement more appropriate." Of course, Ushakov fails to mention the scale of the Russian casualties required for any progress that the country's military makes, and he certainly doesn't mention how little territory Russia has captured in the whole of the Ukraine war, or that the fall of Pokrovsk was fabricated by Putin and his cronies as a means to manipulate the US into pressuring Ukraine to accept a peace deal that doesn't fully reflect what's happening on the battlefield. For its part, the US is trying to be cagey about how it will approach the next rounds of peace talks. On December 8th, Kyiv Independent reported on comments made by the US ambassador to NATO, Matt Whitaker, who made it clear that Trump is also looking for leverage in peace negotiations. Whitaker claimed that significant progress had been made in peace efforts, though it was still possible that Trump might step away if he felt that there was no deal to be had. But Whitaker's most important comment was that Trump understands how to put leverage on both Russia and Ukraine to get a peace deal. Mixed messages about applying leverage and possibly walking away aside, the comments raised the question of how much credence the Trump administration affords Russia's claims of making large advances. On one hand, Whitaker's mentions of applying leverage against Ukraine suggest that the US may be taking Putin's claims somewhat seriously. On the other hand, Whitaker mentions Russia in that same claim, and the US ended up walking away from the Moscow peace discussions without an agreement, suggesting that it still doesn't see eye to eye with Russia on how such a deal should look. Assuming that the US still favors Ukraine, which is never a given, then the figures released by The Economist, with an assist from the Institute for the Study of War, don't paint Russia's battlefield situation in a great light. Beyond the decades that will be needed to conquer Ukraine and the 2.5 years Russia will still have to fight to fully occupy the country's east, the sheer scale of Russia's losses in making its 1.5% gains over 3 years signals the situation for Russia isn't as strong as Putin claims. Still, we can't ignore the speeding up that we touched upon earlier. In the context of Ukraine as a whole, Russia's November gains are still unimpressive. However, the country is pushing closer to taking Pokrovsk, and it may try to use that fact as yet more leverage in future negotiations. But even then, Russia would be ignoring what comes after Pokrovsk. Gains are accelerated right now because Ukraine is conducting tactical withdrawals while bleeding the Russian army. Once Pokrovsk and the nearby city of Mirnorad fall, Russia is going to end up right back in the same cycle, losing thousands of soldiers for microscopic gain. Donetsk isn't going to fall just because Russia captures Pokrovsk. The Independent made this point in November, noting that there will be little left of Pokrovsk once it does fall, and the battle that Russia faces afterward will be just as fierce. The landscape behind the Ukrainian front lines has been prepared for a fighting retreat by key forces. Thousands of miles of trenches, barriers, tank traps, and barbed wire mazes have been laid, the outlet points out. No doubt secret minefields, stay-behind bunkers for behind-the-lines operations, and meticulously calibrated targeting will make Russia's next phase another session in the meat grinder of Ukraine's eastern front. Bear in mind that Pokrovsk, though it was important for much of the Donetsk campaign, is far from a major Ukrainian city. None of the country's largest cities has fallen to Russia yet, and the cities that remain in Donetsk are now extremely well fortified. Ukraine will also have used Pokrovsk as a blueprint for how Russia intends to conduct its assaults on Donetsk's other cities. If it took 14 months, and counting, for Russia to take Pokrovsk, there's a good chance that the remaining Donetsk cities will take just as long to fall. All the while, Russia will be losing troops by the tens of thousands each month. That is Ukraine's leverage. The more people that Russia loses, the slower the advances are, and the more that Ukraine can point to Russia's losses as examples of how it's bleeding Putin dry. How much longer can Russia fight before its leader completely cripples his own military and the country that has been propping that military up for the last few years? The counter-argument is that Ukraine isn't in the healthiest position itself. As Euromaidan Press notes, Ukraine has suffered heavy losses in its defense, to the point where it's also short on manpower. Those losses aren't as massive as Russia's, though Ukraine also hasn't revealed its full extent. In a November 28th piece, Al Jazeera's Sergei Maydukov also claimed that Ukraine is running out of men, money and time. Around 21,000 Ukrainian soldiers left their army in October alone, Maydukov claims. A radical overhaul of the country's military and mobilization structures may be needed for Ukraine to retain the levels of manpower it needs to continue causing as much damage to Russia as it is. The US could also add to Ukraine's woes. The latter half of 2025 has seen Ukraine intensify its attacks on Russia's oil industry as the country tries to slow down the Russian war machine, hurt the Russian economy, and cause domestic strife for Putin. You can find out more about how successful these efforts have been in our video. However, these attacks are all long-range strikes that are being aided by US military intelligence. When the Trump administration mentioned the leverage it has on Ukraine, that intelligence is at the forefront. Bloomberg made that point in November, stating that the US cutting military intelligence to Ukraine could hurt the country even more than America choosing to cut off access to arms. Don't assume this isn't a possibility. The US blocked Ukraine from receiving intelligence, albeit temporarily, in March of this year. So the US still plays a key role in everything that could happen in the Ukraine war in the future, from peace negotiations to Ukraine's ongoing success against Russia. Assuming that Ukraine retains America's support, meaning that Trump uses his country's leverage against Russia, the small gains for massive losses that Putin has made in Ukraine over the last 3 years could be what ultimately ends the Ukraine war. In other words, it may be discontent from inside Russia that topples Putin, with Ukraine's task being to hang on until that discontent ferments. The oil strikes we mentioned earlier are part of a campaign to create anger against Putin inside Russia. On December 3rd, the Daily Express reported that support for the war in Russia also seems to be drying up. The outlet claims that polling inside Russia shows that 56% of people now want an immediate end to the war, with support for a continuation dropping to just 23%. Of those questioned, 83% say they now feel fatigued by their leader's war. Assuming these numbers are accurate, they suggest that everyday Russians are keen for an end to come now that the prospect of peace seems to be on the table. If Putin continues the war under these conditions, there's a chance that this kind of sentiment could increase to the point where Putin has to stop just to keep his own people happy. The more deaths that Ukraine can cause while slowing Russia's advances as much as possible, the more likely this outcome becomes. After all, it seems that Russia's people are very aware that Putin is hurting them to sustain his own ambition. The cracks are already starting to show inside Russia. A Russian general has already betrayed Putin by revealing that the Ukraine invasion failed on day one. That general tells a story of Kremlin miscalculation, useless intelligence, and a brutal war that cost Russia far more than it ever anticipated. You can learn about that betrayal in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the reality that Putin faces in Ukraine. And thank you, as always, for watching.